Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. I'm Richard Harris, your host, and very excited to have you joining us for today's program. We have a very special guest in store. I think today's episode is going to really be encouraging and a learning opportunity for many people. So I'm very excited about that. Before we get into my monologue, though, I wanted to mention a couple of things to you. The annual Truth and Liberty Conference is coming up quick. It's scheduled for September 11th through the 13th here at the beautiful campus of Charis Bible College in Woodland Park. And our speakers include the one and only Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is going to be kicking things off for us at the conference, and he is an awesome speaker, an incredible debater, and we are really looking forward to having Charlie's insights with us. Also, Pastor Lorenzo Sewell, he's the guy that led the amazing prayer at Donald Trump's inauguration. What a man of God he is. Also, Congressman Jeff Crank and Laura Smaltz, myself, Andrew Womack, and others. It's going to be a great time. So go to our website at truthandliberty.net and you can register today. Don't miss this event. It's going to be awesome. Also, if you want to know how you can make a difference by turning America back to God, I honestly can't think of any better way than becoming a member of Truth and Liberty. Members are those folks who decide they want to partner with us on a regular monthly basis and sign up to make an automatic recurring monthly contribution in any amount on our website. If you do that, you become a Truth and Liberty member and you help us restore America's heritage. You help us equip the body of Christ to stand for truth. You help us to inspire and to motivate and to mobilize pastors and many others to make a difference. And we are making a difference here. God is really expanding our influence in a major way. So if you want to become a member today, pray about that, would you? And just go to our website, sign up, and you'll be a Truth and Liberty member. All right, folks, what I want to talk about today is the very, very important subject of freedom of religion. You know, freedom of religion is the first of the first. What do you mean by that, Richard? Well, if you look in the Constitution of the United States, if you look at the Bill of Rights, what's the Bill of Rights? We used to know these things, so I got to sometimes say what a lot of us consider to be common knowledge, but the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They were all passed in the first Congress of the United States and adopted. In fact, the founders promised the people of the country, the first thing we'll do is take up a Bill of Rights. And based on that assurance, the people ratified the Constitution. Well, what is the first right that is guaranteed in the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution? It is freedom of religion. The First Amendment in the first 10, and the first right in the First Amendment in the first 10 is freedom of religion. The Bill of Rights says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You see, our founding fathers understood that we do not want a state church in this country. We don't want an established church where the government is controlling the church and funding the church and requiring membership in the church and all these sorts of things that went along with an established church. But they also said that we don't want Congress restricting the free exercise of religion. We don't want Congress telling people how, when, where they should engage in religious practices or worship God or not worship God or not engage in religious practices. And the First Amendment, because of some wrong thinking and wrong interpretations, has undergone an absolute assault in the last 100 years in our country. And the freedom to practice our religion, especially in the public square, especially in regard to government, has been curtailed to levels that our founding fathers, I dare say, would have thought to be abominable. And, there is nowhere in our culture and society where this curtailment of freedom of religion has been felt more acutely than in the area of education. Education is so incredibly important because this is where we're teaching the youth of our country what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what is true, not true, and the things which are important. It used to be in America and in Western civilization that Christians, through the church, educated the youth of the country. Our cultures used to be so Christian that this was understood to be a church, primarily a church function. But you see, the church in America ceded, in other words, gave away this power, this control to the government through what was called the public education movement. In the late 19th century, people like Horace Mann and Charles Dewey began to advocate for public education, meaning by public they mean state-sponsored, government-funded, mandatory, compulsory education for all children. We're going to pass laws across the country requiring every children to go to school. And they have to go to a public school unless they already go to a private school. And furthermore, the state is going to pay for that public education. Wow, sounds great, right? We're going to get our kids educated. Nobody's going to be left behind. Everybody's going to learn to read and write and learn history and become good, patriotic, contributing citizens of our nation, right? This is what was promised. What we didn't know at the time, though, we didn't know the nefarious agenda behind the advocates of public education. You see, these guys, Horace Mann, Charles Dewey, and many others, were secular humanists. That's right. They were secular humanists. They were not Christians, and they did not like the influence that the church had on public policy and on all things civic in our nation. And they wanted to raise up the youth of this generation in a secular, humanistic mindset. And so today in America, we have 56 million children who are in public schools. 83% of the children, school-age kids in this country are in public schools. 10% are in private, 7% in charter. I got news for the stats here. Charter is public school, by the way. Okay, but so we've got 90% in public or charter schools, and then we only have 10% in private. That doesn't count, though, the 3.7 million homeschoolers, which is about 6.73%. So I know those percentages don't add up, but what you can see is the vast majority, millions and millions of children, tens of millions in America today are educated in public schools. And what we see is that the founders of the public education movement believed that schools were a vehicle for social change. Charles Dewey said schools should take an active part in directing social change and share in the construction of a new social order. There was a headline just the other day out of the annual convention of the National Teachers Association, National Education Association, which is the National Teachers Union, adopting a whole slew of political agenda items, political resolutions, all of which were slamming and critical of Donald Trump and MAGA and conservative agenda items, calling for radicalization, calling for activism, and all this. You see, the teachers are political, and the teachers are left-wing. Not all of them. Understood. If you're a teacher or you know a teacher who's good, Christian, conservative, I understand. But the institution as a whole is very progressive. They give all of their money, the political donations, which are, I think, $200 to $300 million a year, they give almost all of it to Democratic candidates. And they are opposing parents. They are saying parents don't have rights to control the education of their children. They're inculcating the kids today with Marxist and humanistic and LGBT ideologies. Let me elaborate on this. The humanists felt like religion should be kept out of education. They were actually the prophets of the modern separation of the church and state philosophy. And so as a result of that, beginning with Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court in 1947, saying that the Constitution requires a separation of church and state. This is in the context of schools. Everson versus Board of Education. There has to be a strict separation. It's a wall that we can't allow the slightest breach, the court held. A few years later, in 1963, in a case called Engel v. Vitale, the U.S. Supreme Court said children cannot pray in schools. We cannot have children, we cannot have school-led prayer. A few years later, they said, oh, you can't even have student-led prayer, and you can't even have, a few years later, voluntary moments of silence because kids might think that there's an implied invitation to pray. Okay? And then in 1987, the court in Edwards versus Aguillard held you can't teach creation science in schools. You can only teach, when it comes to origins, materialistic evolution, atheistic evolution. In the case of Abington versus Shemp in 1962, the court held children in our public schools cannot read the Bible. You cannot present the Bible to them for reading, and because they might read things that might harm them or psychologically traumatize them, or worse of all, might inculcate in them a religious belief. And then in 1980, in the case of Stone v. Graham, the U.S. Supreme Court held that we cannot display the 10 Commandments on the walls of our schoolhouses because even though most of those commandments have to do with moral conduct among humans, the first 3 or 4 of them have to do with belief in God. And we can't have that. We can't have our kids being taught that there's a God and that you need to honor Him and not take His name in vain and not worship idols. We can't do that because we have to have this strict separation of church and state. Now, it should come as no surprise that because of this secularization, this implied anti-Christian ideation, that our kids today in school are not taught the Judeo-Christian foundations of America or the biblical principles that underlie our country that are in the very Declaration of Independence that is our national birth certificate. Instead, our children are being indoctrinated in unbiblical anti-God ideas like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is basically moral relativism gone amok, CRT, which is critical race theory, which is Marxism applied to race theory, or vice versa. And then you have radical LGBT ideology. Boys can be girls and girls can be boys, and you can be attracted to a boy one day, a girl the next, or a fence post for all we care. There's no morality when it comes to sex. It's full moral relativism. There is no truth. Whatever you think you are, you can be that, and you not only can imagine it in your mind, we have an obligation as loving people to affirm you in your delusions. And furthermore, everywhere you turn in our public schools today, children are being taught to disparage the family. The family is harmful and destructive and not the basis of civilized society, but rather an institution that enslaves people. Parents are the enemy. Teachers are the hero. Disrespect of authority. You got to hate the police, and you can't trust anybody in authority. All the heroes in American history were actually bad, evil men, slaveholders, racists, money-grubbing capitalists, and on we go. They teach our kids today. I'll never forget when my son came home with an assignment from a private Christian school even that said that Karl Marx was a good-hearted social reformer. Washington and Jefferson, on the other hand, as I said, are deistic, bigoted, slave-holding capitalists. Tolerance is the highest virtue in our schools today, not truth. Abortion is an acceptable pregnancy outcome. That's in the letter of the law in the state of Colorado. All sex is okay as long as it's quote-unquote consensual, but there's no age limits on sex, right? Question, how can you consent when you're underage? We don't even let 17-year-olds sign binding contracts. How can we say they can consent to sex legally? Folks, we've produced a nation of vacuous, amoral people. Now, don't get me wrong. The Third Great Awakening is underway. God is doing awesome stuff, especially in the youngest generations. I am so excited about our future of our country. But we still need to deal with and face these realities. We've got to uproot this stuff out of our culture. Young people today, if it weren't for the Great Awakening, are self-centered, thinking only about their own quote-unquote experience. They're being taught from the earliest ages that their feelings are what matters. Their personal experience is what matters. That all truth and objective morality is trumped by these feelings and their personal desires. They are not being given any rational framework for viewing the world or explaining the presence of evil or the future state or origins or anything like this. Actual knowledge and academic performance continue to decline across the country. Despite seeing a 245% increase in spending since 1970, student performance in America is at the lowest rate ever. Only 25% of our students in 8th grade can read at grade level. But I want to say this. things are changing. Good things are happening in America today. Beginning with the Mergen case in the 1990s, the Supreme Court of the United States has begun to dial back on this radical separation of church and state idea. The court held in Mergens that Christian clubs have a right to equal access to school campuses as do any other club. In the case of Zoman, 2002, and Carson in 2022, the Supreme Court held that voucher and school choice programs are constitutional as long as they aren't limited to or give preference to religious education. If they're neutrally available, then Christian programs can compete in those voucher and school choice programs just as well as any other. Then we have the Kennedy case just a few years ago, I believe it was in 2022, when the court held that the Bremerton, Washington School District violated the Constitution when it fired Coach Joe Kennedy for simply voluntarily praying at the 50-yard line after school football games, and the fact that students, both from his team and other teams, were joining him at that 50-yard line for voluntary prayer. The court said that's not a violation of the Constitution. That's his First Amendment right to do that. The court overturned the infamous Lemon versus Kurtzman decision, which had it required strict separation and strict neutrality and no entanglement and all these other unconstitutional ideas. And then we have the case of the Cross case, which came out of Maryland, the Bladensburg War Memorial case out of Bladensburg, Maryland, where the court held that a cross, a large cross, albeit, erected in a cemetery by the mothers of World War I veterans, did not have to be torn down even though the government now owned that property. And in those two cases, Bremerton and the Cross case, the court said, you know what, we're going to look at historically acceptable religious practices in this nation. We're not going to ignore history anymore. We're going to look back even all the way to the founding to decide what has been the traditionally accepted as the role of the government when it comes to religion. And so now prayer, voluntary prayer by students and staff in schools is permissible. Religious symbols on government property can be permissible. And then we have the Mahmoud case decided just a few weeks ago by the U.S. Supreme Court, reaffirming that parents have a fundamental right to the religious training and education of their children. And because of that fundamental free exercise right, parents can opt their children out of indoctrination and teaching in the public schools which they believe is contrary to their religious beliefs. In that particular case, in Maryland, I think it was Baltimore, kids were being taught radical LGBT ideology in books and stuff like that, and the court held that parents have a right to say, no, my kid's not going to sit in on those classes. And then we see what Donald Trump is doing by banning all DEI in the federal government, in offices, positions, also prohibiting all gender ideology in federal programs and grants, and dismantling, for the most part, the Department of Education and sending it back to the states. So folks, great things are happening in America today on this front. But what I'm calling on you to do today is not to lose sight, not to become complacent. But in fact, as I said to somebody earlier today, it's not a time to wring our hands. It's a time to roll up our sleeves. Let's work harder than we ever have before to restore the fundamental principle of freedom of religion to our nation, especially in our schools. And here to discuss the changes in religious liberty going on in America today, especially in our schools, is Kesha Russell. Kesha is senior counsel with First Liberty Institute, founded by Kelly Shackelford, and she concentrates on religious liberty matters. She studied law at Emory University's School of Law, where she was heavily involved in their prestigious Center for the Study of Law and Religion. She served on their legal law journal, went on to work for the American Center for Law and Justice with Jay Sekulow, and then became actually a school teacher for a little while, and has now gone to work for First Liberty, where she is championing our original freedoms, and she's also the author of a very excellent book called Uncommon Courage, and she's going to talk about all these legal developments and more with us. So I want you to stay tuned today, and I'll be back in a minute and a half with Kesha Russell. Before we go there, let me let you know about our free product giveaway. It's my booklet, Faith, for America. Did you know that God has a covenant with America, and that at key moments of crisis throughout our nation's history, Americans have turned to God and God has responded, and He's rescued our nation and been faithful time and again to save us from loss and disaster, and to heal our nation and restore us, and even to give us the prosperity, success, and victory that we enjoy today. And I believe God is still with us now today and will honor our prayers and is honoring our prayers and our faith. So it's a time to renew that faith and commitment to the Lord. You can pick up a copy of this booklet at no charge today by going to the website at truthandlibertygtn.com, truthandlibertygtn.com, and signing up, and you'll get a free copy of my booklet, Faith for America. I believe it'll be a blessing to you. Stand by. We're going to share some information with you, and we'll be right back with attorney Kesha Russell. Are you passionate about standing for truth in the culture, but don't know how to get started? Well, Truth and Liberty, our mission is to educate, unify, and mobilize the body of Christ to stand for truth in the public square. And as part of our mission, we provide you with an amazing array of resources on our website. And our website has just been revamped, remodeled, and retooled to be user-friendly. And I'm so excited about it because I believe that there's nothing like it out there anywhere. I want to encourage you today to go to truthandliberty.net and check out the Resources Center and the Get Equipped Center. On our Resources Center, you will find hundreds of links, hundreds of videos, articles, blogs, even America's original founding documents can be found on Truth and Liberty's Resources Center. It's searchable by topic, preset topic, or you can put in a custom search to find exactly what you need and what you're interested in. In the Get Equipped section, we link you to tools created by our strategic partners, including Pray, Vote, and Engage tools. We culture impact teams, civic action teams, biblical citizenship in modern America, biblical worldview training, and more. So go today to truthandliberty.net and find what you need to get equipped to stand for truth in the public square. All right, welcome back to the Truth and Liberty Show. I'm very honored and excited today to have as our guest Kesha Russell, Senior Counsel with First Liberty Institute and the author of a new book called Uncommon Courage. Kesha, thanks so much for joining us on Truth and Liberty.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Kesha, I want to know more about how you acquired a passion for religious liberty. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I started out in education. I was a teacher for a couple of years in Atlanta public schools and was very passionate about education in general. And I kind of thought that's where I would end up and that's where God would have me. And I think what he actually did was use that time to develop my advocacy skills and develop my passion for being an advocate and standing up for people's rights and things like that. So I went to law school. It seemed like a very natural progression. And within Emory Law, which is where I went to law school, there is a Center for the Study of Law and Religion. And that's where I was introduced to this, area of law. I was mentored by a rabbi there, and he worked in conjunction with ACLJ. So we did a lot of work on behalf of the Jewish community, which I really enjoyed. And then after I graduated from law school, I ended up at First Liberty. So,
wow, that's fantastic. And both ACLJ and First Liberty are doing such an important work in our country, along with other groups like Liberty Counsel and, of course, Alliance Defending Freedom and Thomas More and Pacific Justice. There's so many now that are just having so much success in the courts. Pushing back to a proper interpretation of the First Amendment. And that's got to be really gratifying for you to be a part of that.
Oh, yeah. I feel really, I feel favored, frankly, to be at First Liberty at this time when God is just doing so many amazing things for the country, for our first freedom, and at the Supreme Court. It's really amazing to see. And just looking at the wins that we've received, just as a small organization, or really not that big, the impact we're able to have is really incredible, and we definitely punch above our weight.
Yeah, well, you're great lawyers. That's a big part of it. But Kesha, you've got a book. It's called Uncommon Courage, and folks need to get a hold of this thing because it really is a message for this day and hour. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I wrote it, and I was really inspired by the work I was doing at First Liberty. But the other thing was, I was disheartened by Christians that didn't seem to understand the Constitution, didn't really seem to understand their rights, and even more disturbing, they didn't understand why.
Mm.
The forefathers thought these rights were so central and so important. And I realized that a lot of Christians were really miseducated by the media. They're being told a lot of lies about what the Constitution says and does. And so I really wanted to break down for primarily the Christian community, but anyone interested in knowing that foundation about how much Christianity has shaped America, and even more, why the forefathers chose Christianity, even
Mm.
though not all of them were Christians. We know that they were all educated in the Bible, but I think it's important that Christians understand why Christianity was the framework for America and why it's been so successful, because that's sort of the first step. And then the next step is understanding that, we're in a battle, and no matter what the media says or what anyone says, God is still on the throne, and he does expect us to stand up for him and his truth and his standards, even in a
Mm.
hostile culture.
Yeah, amen. Well, just a little rabbit trail here for just a second, but it was probably about 4 months ago or so, I think, when Christopher Dawkins in the UK, who's an atheist, said, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he said that he was mourning the decline of Christianity in his nation because of the cultural influences of it and the positive impact that it had on the culture. Do you remember seeing that in the news? And what
I
thoughts do you have
do.
about that? Is that ironic?
I do. And I've actually run into more than one person who has expressed a concern that, the liberals seem to be wanting to destroy the idea of moral absolutes.
Hmm.
And I can see that being a concern even for people who aren't Christians, right? There are so many things that we all agree on as a country, as a society, about what is right and what is wrong. And I think we're in an era where people don't want there to be moral absolutes, and they want their feelings to be supreme. They want
Hmm.
their, emotions to be supreme. And the Bible predicts all of that,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it just proves just how on point the Bible is in predicting people's behavior and predicting the impact that being without God will have on society. And so seeing people who have sort of watched the progression actually call it out, I think this just proves just that the Bible is the truth.
Well, Kesha, you said just a minute ago that Christians have been lied to about the Constitution. And one of the biggest lies of all is got to be the phrase separation of church and state. Do you agree with that? And can you expound on that a little bit?
I absolutely agree with that. That is probably one of the most predominant lies, and we know that that phrase comes from a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson. And really, the message of that letter was telling the government that the government needed to stay out of the church's affairs, like their internal affairs. It wasn't about banning religion from the public square, which is what people use it for now. And I think this Supreme Court has really done a great job of restoring the full scope of freedom that I think our forefathers wanted when they instituted both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And I think one of the most important things that has come out of it is the Supreme Court explaining that the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause are not warring provisions. They are supposed to be complementary. And so one is not supposed to outweigh the other, they're supposed to complement each other.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, we know that there are many instances where people will say religion doesn't belong here, but under the Free Exercise Clause, under the First Amendment, it would actually be government hostility to religion to ban
Mhm.
religion from the public square. And so we know both things can't be true. So that is, I think I would agree that that is one of the biggest lies for sure.
In my monologue for today's show, Kesha, I kind of ran through some of the more infamous Supreme Court cases when it came to education. Aguilard and some of these others. No prayer, no Bible reading, no Ten Commandments, and on we go. It seems like that the philosophy of that was we were sold on. We were kind of sold a bill of goods, but the philosophy was that we just have to be neutral, right? We're not going to be against God or for God. We're just going to be quote unquote secular. now after 60 plus years of this so-called neutrality, were we duped? Is it possible to be neutral when it comes to an issue so fundamental as the existence of God?
I think so. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So let's take Texas's Blue Bonnet curriculum as an example, or even the Ten Commandments, right? If the Bible, which is the Blue Bonnet, is a curriculum that is infused with biblical content in order to sort of raise the level of context, the education that the students are receiving about how the Bible has shaped history. So, for example, they read the Good Samaritan story and then they study the laws that came from that story. Okay. So, if, for example, the Ten Commandments was not in the Bible and it has shaped American history the way that we all know it did, would we study it? Of course we would study it. The only reason why people don't want to study it is because it's religious, and even more so because it's Christian, right? Because you'll hear a lot of people say, well, why aren't we studying Buddhism or Hinduism? But none of those religions have had the same impact on American society as Christianity. And so the idea is that students need this information, they need to understand it. And if you prevent them from learning it because it's Christian, that itself is a problem under the Establishment Clause. The government can't just say, oh, well, it's useful, but it's Christian, so we don't want to teach it. That is not neutrality, right? And so I think when you think about the idea of neutrality, there are a number of layers. But in terms of teaching, educating, if you use that that idea of neutrality, you're going to find that a lot of this Christian content very well belongs in education. The other thing I'll say about neutrality is this: when the government is choosing what it wants to say, it doesn't have to be neutral.
Well, before 1962, it was commonplace, right, for our kids in public school to read the Bible and pray at the start of every day. And it had been that way for to some extent or another since the founding of the Republic. I mean, even beyond the very first public education in America was started for one purpose, that is to teach kids to read so they could read the Bible. There's so much more evidence on this we could talk about. But how was it that the Supreme Court was able to completely set aside 350 years of history in those 1960s cases and say, no, strict separation, we're not going to have God in public schools anymore. We can't allow that. Someone might end up actually believing it.
So there's a case, as you probably know, called Lemon versus Kurtzman, right? And that kind of set out this test under the Establishment Clause that said, look, the government can't be entangled with religion. It can't endorse religion. It has to have a secular purpose, whatever that means now. And it was just so entirely subjective that you could pretty much toss out anything religious if you wanted to. And even before then, I think the general sort of postmodern culture, I think, sort of allowed for the government to extinguish religion, especially Christianity. Now, I would say religion, but really remember that the goal is to, cancel Christianity. It's not necessarily cancel all religions.
Right.
And so we know that that is the case. So I think where the Supreme Court in general was at that point, it was very much open to, okay, well, school district doesn't want to include religion. They don't have to, or they shouldn't, because that means they're too close to religion. But there's no separating the government from our religious history. You really can't do that, particularly in education, because you can't give students a comprehensive education if you're eliminating messages that you don't like.
Yeah. Well, Kesha, so let's go to the Bible for just a second. It says in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. So with that as true, our kids today in our schools are being taught that there is no truth, that you have your truth, I have my truth, that there's no objective morality. What is moral is subjective, or moral relativism, as we call it. And then they're also even taught that, well, there's really no God because you came about by accident. Pure materialistic evolution is the only explanation of origins that is allowed in our schools. So if we have to know God in order to discover truth, how are we going to be effective in teaching our children truth if we're not allowed to talk about God and provide that base level of understanding that the Scripture says is necessary in order to find truth?
Well, it's hard to do because the public schools are so antagonistic
Mm-hmm.
towards it right now. But I think the goal is to capture the public schools. Obviously, parents have, the authority, the right, and the responsibility to infuse those beliefs into their children. So when they go to school, the kids are not necessarily relying on a teacher or an administrator to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, once you teach your child the truth and they go to school, they'll recognize the lie, or at least they'll realize there's a tension, and there will be an opportunity to fix that tension with the parents or friends or whatever it is. So I think ultimately, I don't understand why schools are this way now, because I believe the left has decided, we're going to make sure that there is no one available or willing, or at least most people won't be willing to object to what we want in the future, because we have completely captured the minds of 90% of the students. And we know 90% of students go to public schools. And so I think what they're looking at is conquering the minds of the next generation. And the only way to do that is to make sure that those morals that we have, that, a lot of people on the conservative side have, will say, these things were wrong. The left doesn't want to have to deal with that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to make sure that the next generation is indoctrinated in such a way where they don't even know this information in order to object. They just, ingest everything they're being taught at the public schools, no matter how impractical and illogical any of these things are. And they also are not learning to critically think or debate in an appropriate way. And so they just stay blind and, for lack of a better word, dunce. And they don't know that, and they can't actually see when their own rights are being taken away from them, right? It's just like any tyrannical regime will sometimes just make sure that their population doesn't know any better. They don't know what's happening. And so they can't fight back because they don't know how, and they don't know that they should.
Right. Well, and you're right to refer to tyrannical regimes. One of the things that tyrannical regimes always do, they take away the guns, but one of the other things they do is they take the kids and they begin to indoctrinate the young people. Hitler did it, Stalin did it, Mussolini did it, the Romans did it. I mean, it goes all the way back. And we have a recent Supreme Court case now in America, just last week decided, called Mahmoud versus Taylor, I believe, which is could be a really important development that restores parental control over education. Am I right on that? And what do you know about this case?
No, absolutely. I know a good bit. Our friends at Beckett litigated this case. We at First Liberty filed an amicus brief on behalf of a parent named Abigail Martinez, who was in California. And her daughter was socially transitioned by the school without her permission, without her knowledge. Then she was emotionally threatened, basically that emotional blackmail that we see the Supreme Court referring to Mahmoud, saying, do you want a dead daughter or a living son? Right? And so that's what they do. And then they told her daughter, well, if you leave your mother's house, the government will pay for your transition. All of these just horrible things. Her daughter ends up committing suicide, unfortunately.
Oh.
And there's nothing Abigail can now do to save her daughter, Jaylee, right? And so we tell her story in our amicus brief, in this case, and probably about 7 or 8 others on these issues, including the Tennessee bill that was approved by the Supreme Court, saying that states can block gender affirming care for minors, right? And so this story is I think one of the worst side of what you're going to see when you look at a case like Mahmoud. Mahmoud is basically about parents who want to have notice and opt out when the school is going to teach their students or their kids about sexuality, gender, all of these things. And the school, I believe this was in Maryland, said, no, you don't get an opt out, you don't get notice. You don't get it.
Yeah, and they were reading gay books, LGBT storybooks to young children, right?
Yeah, so they're reading these books, and We're talking pre-K, elementary age children. Okay, so very young. And they're encouraged to read these controversial books, which are very one-sided about the issue. So they're not just teaching them about it, which I think is not age appropriate anyway. They're teaching them how to view it, how to perceive it, how to look at it in a moral way, right? And so a variety of parents, Islam, or Islamic parents, Jewish parents, Christian parents, and they sued and said, look, these are our kids. We're allowed to, under the free exercise clause, under Yoder, under a lot of these cases that said, we have a right as parents to control the upbringing of our children. And the Supreme Court agreed with them, 6-3. Obviously, the liberals are on the other side of this issue. And it's really great, I think, just to see this tide starting to change, because we've done so much damage to our children. I'm just so afraid to see what's going to happen to some of these kids in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
A lot of these kids that have been experimented on, basically. And, we're going to have to deal with the consequences of what happens to those kids. So I'm glad that, the Supreme Court, the government, and the Trump administration, I'm glad that they're all really locking down on this issue and ensuring that parents are returned their rights to bring up their own children.
Yeah, and the Mahmoud decision held that those parents did have a right to notice and to opt out from training or teaching that was contrary to their religious beliefs. Where do you see this case headed, Kesha? Because it seems like we should probably expect a flurry of challenges now in the courts on that and various other things. Like, for example, if my kid in public school is being taught that he evolved from a monkey, could I object to that?
Yeah, well, here's a couple things. For this particular case, as it relates to the sexual orientation issue, gender identity, those kinds of issues, I think those are going to be fairly easy to control. I think after Mahmoud, we'll see some other cases that will recognize parental rights more broadly and say even parents that don't have religious objections can control this and say, no, I don't want it. Even if, whether I have a religious objection or not, I don't want you teaching my child about sex. So right. I think the scope of this particular decision will be expanded in some future cases. That's the first thing. The second one is, okay, well, what other content can we object to? And I do get this question a lot about evolution and things like that. And I say, it's not necessary. I think there are a few people who will say it's completely against their religious beliefs for their students or their children to know about evolution or to know that it's a theory. The reason why I say that is because understanding that people believe that or think it is not the problem. The problem is when we teach it to students as if it's a fact and it's the truth. And they should believe it over everything else, including creationism and all these other things. And so that's harder to opt out of, but it doesn't mean we won't be able to at some point. So I always tell people I think it's more about controlling how the students are receiving that information. And that as it relates to the evolution question, and whether it's being taught in the context of this being theory or truth. And I always tell people, look, there's evolution, there's creationism, there's Big Bang, there are all these things that I do think students should know that they exist, right? Students should know Big Bang exists.
But the theory as a scientific theory. Yeah.
Yes, but should they be taught that we all know that this is what happened as a fact?
Right, and by law, prohibited from hearing other reasonable explanations of origins.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. That's right. Well, one other really interesting thing as I read through Mahmoud was the court cited as an example of the objectionable content that the kids were being taught, that the parents had a right to object to, was a book that endorsed same-sex marriage. So I thought it was really interesting the court chose that one. And I'm just wondering, now this is a little bit of a stretch and it's a little bit far afield, but do you think this court is hinting at the possibility of looking afresh and anew at Obergefell and the whole question of same-sex marriage as a constitutional right?
I doubt it. Now, I'll tell you the reason why I doubt that is because number one, I personally don't know if enough justices have the stomach to overturn it. Now, I will tell you I was wrong about Dobbs because I wasn't sure that some of those conservative justices had the stomach to
Hmm.
really do what needed to be done there. So it's possible, but I think it's unlikely because I don't know if they'd be able to take the backlash for that. I really
Yeah.
don't, and that's really that's my thought about why they wouldn't. Do we? So obviously, substitute due process is a problem, but parental rights exist outside of substitute due process, right? I mean, even
Yeah.
outside of that, we know it exists. So, these other things that have come out of substitute due process, abortion rights and same-sex marriage and things like that, I think it's vulnerable.
Hmm.
Certainly, if you want to evaluate the legal analysis that was used.
Well, if you look at Dobbs, for example, and we're just a little here lawyer back and forth is all.
Yeah,
In Dobbs, the court basically said there was no foundation for the Roe decision in the Constitution at all, and the same thing has to be said about same-sex marriage, that it is 100% built on the whole idea of the Constitution being a living document and the winds of the times and all of this sort of thing. But the Western civilization has never embraced homosexual marriage, especially here in America. And to say that it not only does I mean, it'd be one thing if the court said, yeah, a state can approve it if they want to, but no, they went and they said, you must approve it under the Constitution that says nothing about it. So I'm
yeah,
just
I agree.
wondering if they may have painted themselves into a corner with that, and then with their other cases at this point. So
Yeah,
maybe I'm too
that's where I'm
optimistic.
going. I mean, I think it's going to be difficult because Obergefell is not that old of a decision either, right?
Right.
So it's you've got some explaining to do
Yes.
when you undo a precedent that's been on the books for about 10 minutes. So
Yeah.
you've got to be able to explain why and how, and and obviously the purists on the court we're not worried about.
Yeah.
We know the purists on the court are going to be your Alito's, your Thomas. They're going to have a very clear argument about why this should happen this way. The other ones, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's Gorsuch and maybe Barrett that we have to be concerned about on that. But
Okay.
hey, let's talk about for a minute the two cases that are like that originated. You guys were the lead counsel on that have just, I think, transformed modern First Amendment law. That's the Bladensburg War Memorial case and the Bremerton, Washington versus Kennedy case, or Kennedy v. Bremerton. Anyway, school prayer, Coach Joe, praying Joe, and the court holding that he had a constitutional right to pray at the 50-yard line, even though he's employed by the school district as a coach, and students were joining him, and they set aside the Lemon decision. And can you talk more about that? Kelly, last time I heard him talk, he always mentions that case. Is it turning out to be the landmark atomic bomb decision in First Amendment law that we all thought it would be?
It is. Now, that case started before I even got to First Liberty. I started in First Liberty 2017, and that case, it went on for about 7 years, 7 or 8
Hmm.
years.
Yeah, Coach
And they
Joe nearly
lost.
lost his marriage because of it, but
Oh yeah, I lost.
yeah,
There was a lot. I mean,
yeah.
so much
Mm,
that you have to go through when you litigate like that. And it's just not just the clients, but the lawyers. We're very invested, and we know how important it is.
mm,
Um, because losing that case would have been enormously impactful for public employees all over the country. And so there's a responsibility there, but at the same time, we know that God's on the throne, and so
mm,
we have to do our very very best and let God do the rest. Now, I will say that we lost a number of times, right? Because the Ninth Circuit, the lower courts were all saying, well, the kids can see it, and God forbid the kids should see religion. Now, what I think is
right.
so ironic about that is what we were just talking about in Mahmood and the things that people arguing that kids should see. So they shouldn't see a teacher or coach praying, but they should see, sexual material in a storybook at like 7 years old. So, okay, so there's that. And I think the Supreme Court in when we first went up, the Supreme Court knocked the case back down because they said that there wasn't enough factual development. For your listeners to know, the Supreme Court doesn't develop facts, they only, analyze the law and decide. And so we went back down, but a couple of the justices said, look, we don't like this situation, and we don't like the implication that there is something wrong with students seeing religious employees. That is not something that we've ever said exists or is reasonable. So you need to think about that again. And then we still lost again at the Ninth Circuit. And they basically gave a lot of the same, excuses. But once we got to the Supreme Court, and we were pretty confident because we knew we had this particular court was made up of justices that really believed in constitutional interpretation, originalism, textualism, things like that. And we ended up winning. And now what we see is when we, there are a number of people who want to advance this area of law, education law, and they always want amicus briefs explaining the impact of Kennedy, explaining the impact of American Legion, and talking about the destruction of Lemon and what that actually means for the cases that were decided using that incorrect framework. And so I don't know if you just saw the last 10 Commandments case. The Louisiana 10 Commandments law was struck down by 3 judges, the 3-judge panel at the Fifth Circuit, and they basically said it was unconstitutional under a case that was decided under Lemon. Well, the Supreme Court has already rejected that framework. You don't need the Supreme Court to go back and tell you every single case that uses that framework is now overruled. The framework is overruled, so therefore you cannot use it as a judge. But for whatever reason, that's where the Fifth Circuit went with that. And so I think we'll see an en banc and possibly a cert petition on the 10 Commandments case.
So I was not aware of that. Thank you for mentioning that. That's great news to know that it's in the courts and on the way up. But so what was the new standard in Kennedy, and how will that affect that 10 Commandments case?
Yeah, so the standard in Kennedy, so it was first laid out in American Legion that not this Lemon test, but it's a history and tradition test. What's the history and tradition of doing these things? And also a coercion analysis. What's the coercion level here? And that was also brought into the Kennedy case to say, well, is it some sort of violation of the Establishment Clause just for him to pray? Well, no, because he's the actor here, not the government. It's his personal religious exercise. He's allowed to pray. And just because you're a public school employee, it doesn't mean you don't have any more constitutional rights. So the school district must respect that private speech, because everyone else out here is allowed to speak or call their wives or whatever it is. So why can't he pray and talk to God? So we've got that idea. But even deeper than that, the Supreme Court makes it very clear it doesn't matter if the students can see him. That is not something that we see as outward coercion. Just seeing that your coach is a Christian or your coach is praying, that doesn't mean that coach is now forcing you to do it, which is what coercion requires, right? So there's so many different levels here. And what we're seeing now in another case that we're litigating right now, Marisol Castro, we're testing what's going on with Kennedy in the classroom. And what do I mean by that? So Marisol Castro is a Catholic. She keeps a cross in her little workspace. And she was told she can't have that. It was a crucifix in particular. She's Catholic. And she was kicked out of the classroom because she keeps that crucifix there. And because the students can see it and it's in the classroom, she is no longer in the classroom. So we are in federal court right now. Yeah,
she's a student or teacher?
She's a teacher, 32-year veteran teacher, keeps the crucifix in her personal workspace in the classroom, even though all the other teachers are allowed to have their stuff.
Yeah.
Right? You're allowed to have your New England Patriots thing or whatever it is, your family photo, so you can choose that expression.
Yeah.
So the government can't say, well, you can choose all kinds of expression except religion. We know that's a violation of the free speech clause, the free exercise clause, and definitely the Establishment Clause does not save the district. So a lot of work to do.
Kesha, we're down to 3.5 minutes. I want to make sure that I give you, there's so much more I want to ask you, but I want to give you time to talk about what important cases, you mentioned this one, what other important cases is First Liberty handling right now, and what do we need to be on the lookout for?
Well, definitely I want all of your listeners to go to firstliberty.org and sign up for our insider, because they'll see all the action and we are making sure that everyone is up to date. And so we've got a case, we just had a cert petition granted on a case called Olivier. That's an evangelist case. And then we also have a cert petition pending on a case called Cambridge Christian, which is about two Christian high schools in Florida who were denied the ability to pray over the loudspeaker during their game, even though they were both Christian schools. And they said, well, you can't use our government, microphone to pray, which is insane. So
Yeah.
we're hoping the Supreme Court picks that up. And then, of course, as you know, the IRS situation and the churches, we've got a lot of churches asking about the impact of that decision. So all of that is on our website, and you can, your viewers can read, because I know we don't have enough time to go over everything.
So real quick, the IRS in a settlement earlier this week announced that they were going to interpret the Johnson Amendment to allow churches to endorse or oppose candidates. I say from the pulpit. The language is in traditional methods of communication. I think it's a great day for the church in America, but I'm scratching my head as a lawyer going, okay, there's like 6 or 7 different words used in this language in the settlement. And I'm wondering, what does that mean? How far does this go? Where are the real boundaries? What are your thoughts real quick on this new development?
So all this really means is that religious organizations, houses of worship are allowed to talk to their congregation about which candidates better fit their religious convictions, essentially. And they can say, this is the candidate that I think is, the proper Christian candidate, or whatever it is. And before, that was a problem under the Johnson Amendment. So all the IRS is saying is, we're going to interpret this in such a way that doesn't deprive pastors and other religious leaders of their free speech rights.
And what if we want to speak to the community and not just to people that are sitting in the pews on Sunday morning?
Well, I think that's perfectly fine. Here's why: because most churches are actively involved in outreach all the time.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there's any problem with it. And if anyone has a problem with it, please give us a call. We're happy to help.
Yeah. My 2 cents. We got to push the envelope on this new development and see how far we can take it, because most people get their information online now, not sitting in a pew on Sunday morning for a 25-minute message. But still, it's awesome news. We're making progress. Thanks so much to the work of Kelly Shackelford and all the great lawyers at First Liberty like you, in no small measure. So, Kesha, thank you so much for coming on the show. Real quick again, what's your website and how can people find your book?
Firstliberty.org is the website. Go there. I have a website, KeshaTonyRussell.com, and you can find Uncommon Courage anywhere you get your books. Amazon, at the Harvest House website, which is the publisher, and it's also an audiobook.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, folks. Be sure to tune in next time here on Truth and Liberty.